On the night of August the 6th, 2013, inside a quiet home in Pennsylvania, a single gunshot ended the life of Melissa Rocuba, a 44-year-old mother and loving grandmother. Her husband Bruno, with bloodied hands and panicked eyes, called their daughter with words that would haunt her forever. "There's been an accident. Your mom's okay." But was it really an accident? Bruno claimed he was putting away his gun under the bed when his wife sat down, and the weapon accidentally discharged. The bullet went through his hand before taking the life of the woman he had loved for 25 years. The story seemed plausible, heartbreaking, and tragic. The police believed it, the family believed it, the community sympathized with a man who had lost his wife in an unfortunate accident. But why was Bruno so unusually calm? Why did he spend so little time visiting his wife at the hospital? And why was he so quick to erase every trace of Melissa from their home right after she passed away? 9 years passed in silence. Bruno built a new life, but doubts within the family continued to grow, until two determined investigators discovered shocking evidence that had been forgotten for nearly a decade: audio recordings from the home security system that captured Melissa's final moments. What they heard would completely overturn the story of a tragic accident. Screaming, pleading, and a horrifying truth: Melissa knew she was about to die. This is the story of how a lie can persist for nearly a decade, about the power of technology in seeking truth, and about a voice from beyond the grave becoming the most crucial witness in the victim's own case. The truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how long it takes. The night of August 6th, 2013, began like any other in the town of Simpson, Pennsylvania. Small, charming houses sat side by side in a peaceful neighborhood, where the biggest disputes were usually about who forgot to put out their trash cans. But at 10:30 that evening, the tranquility would be shattered by a single gunshot that echoed through the silent night. Chelsea Chisio, 22 years old, was lying next to her young son in her home, just a few yards away from her parents' house. She had grown accustomed to this life, being a single mother, living close to family for support. Melissa, her mother, had always been a strong woman, once a police officer in her youth and now the family's pillar as a devoted grandmother. The telephone's ring sliced through the night like an emergency alarm. Chelsea opened her eyes in the darkness, her heart pounding. No one called at this hour unless it was urgent. She reached across to the nightstand, grabbing the phone with trembling hands. Bruno's voice came from the other end, her father's voice. But this wasn't his normal tone. This was the voice of a panicked man, breathing heavily, each word weighed down with desperation. Bruno said there had been an accident, that her mother was okay, and that an ambulance was on the way. Those words cut into Chelsea's ears like shards of broken glass. What accident? What did okay mean? Why did they need an ambulance? Without waiting for more answers, Chelsea jumped out of bed and ran barefoot across the yard in the darkness. The distance from her door to her parents' door was only a few steps, but tonight it felt endless. Each bare footstep on the cold ground filled her with growing dread about what awaited her. When Chelsea pushed open the door to her parents' house, a strange smell assaulted her senses. The scent of gunpowder mixed with the thick, metallic smell of fresh blood. Light from the bedroom spilled into the hallway, and she could hear Bruno talking to someone on the phone, probably the emergency dispatcher. Stepping into her parents' bedroom, Chelsea witnessed a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Melissa, the mother she loved and respected most in the world, lay unconscious on the bed. Her head was soaked in blood, and bright red stains had spread across the white sheets, creating horrific patterns no one should ever have to see. The blood wasn't just on the bed. It was splattered across the floor beside the bed, as if some kind of struggle had taken place there. Chelsea screamed her mother's name, her voice trembling and desperate as it echoed through the space. She quickly ran to the bedside, grabbed a towel nearby, and pressed it against the wound on her mother's head, hoping to stop the bleeding. Her hands became stained red, but she didn't care. All she wanted was for her mother to wake up, to talk to her, to tell her that everything would be all right. Meanwhile, Bruno stood somewhere in the room, his left hand carefully bandaged. He seemed strangely calm given the severity of the situation unfolding. When Chelsea asked what had happened, Bruno recounted a story of a tragic accident. He said he was putting away his .40 caliber pistol under the bed when Melissa sat down, and the gun unexpectedly went off. The bullet went through his hand before hitting his wife in the head. The story seemed plausible on the surface, but something didn't feel right. Why wasn't Bruno immediately by his wife's side after the accident happened? Why had he called his daughter before calling 911? And why did he seem so unusually calm in this situation? The ambulance sirens finally sounded from the distance, gradually growing closer. Red and blue flashing lights streamed through the windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The emergency crew rushed in, quickly assessed the situation, and prepared to transport Melissa to the hospital. They worked with cold professionalism, but their eyes said it all. Her condition was critical. While Melissa was being loaded into the ambulance, news of the incident quickly spread to other family members. Sabrina, the older daughter living in Wisconsin, received the phone call and immediately began driving through the night back to Pennsylvania. She couldn't believe this was happening to her family, a family that friends always admired for their happiness and closeness. Joanne, Melissa's sister, also received the news and, along with their father, a veteran police officer from another county, drove at top speed to the hospital. On the way, they prayed for Melissa, hoping that this strong woman would pull through this crisis. At the hospital, Melissa was placed in intensive care and put on life support. The doctors did everything they could, but the head wound was too severe. Bruno was taken to a different hospital to treat his hand injury, where specialists performed surgery to repair the damage the bullet had caused. 3 days passed, like 3 centuries for Melissa's family. They took turns keeping vigil by her bedside, holding her hand, talking to her, hoping she could hear them. But Melissa showed no response. Her brain had been too severely damaged. At 1:45 a.m. on August 10th, the family had to make the most heartbreaking decision of their lives. They decided to remove life support and let Melissa go peacefully. The strong woman, wonderful mother, and loving grandmother left this world, leaving an enormous void in the hearts of those who loved her. Throughout those days, there was one detail that made the family uneasy. Bruno, the husband who had lived with Melissa for 25 years, didn't seem to be present at her bedside as much as they expected. He would visit, stay for about an hour, then leave again. For a man who had just lost his wife in a tragic accident, this behavior seemed strange and difficult to understand. When the first rays of sunlight hit the crime scene, Pennsylvania State Police investigators were already there to begin the meticulous work of evidence collection. They knew that the first 12 hours after any incident are always the most crucial. This is the time when the truth is still fresh, memories haven't been affected, and physical evidence hasn't been disturbed. The first thing that caught the investigators' attention was the wound on Bruno's hand. The bullet had gone straight through his left palm from inside to outside, creating a clean wound that required specialized surgery to repair. The surgeons confirmed this wasn't a surface wound. Bone, tendons, and blood vessels had all sustained significant damage. This raised the first critical question: how could a bullet pass through a man's hand and then continue with enough force to cause a fatal wound to another person's head? The weapon involved was a .40 caliber pistol, a firearm designed with 2 separate safety mechanisms. This meant that for the gun to fire, the user had to simultaneously grip the handle firmly and pull the trigger consciously. Weapons experts confirmed that the possibility of this gun firing automatically was extremely low, nearly impossible under normal circumstances. When examining the scene, investigators noted there were no signs of any struggle or fight. Furniture in the bedroom remained in place. Nothing was broken or in disarray. Blood was concentrated only in the bed area and the floor beside it, indicating the incident happened very quickly and at a fixed location. However, there was one detail they noted, but didn't explore deeply at the time. The family had a home security system that had recorded everything that happened that night. Less than 15 hours after the incident occurred, Bruno was ready to cooperate with police to recreate what he claimed had happened. This made a strong impression on the investigators. Most people in similar situations need time to recover from shock. but Bruno seemed suspiciously calm and ready. During the interrogation, Bruno retold his story with specific details. He said he came home from work at 3:30 in the afternoon, and both he and his wife returned from an evening dinner with friends before 10 p.m. They went downstairs to wash up, then went to bed to prepare for sleep. That's when the tragic accident happened, according to Bruno. To clarify how the incident unfolded, investigators gave Bruno a toy gun and asked him to recreate the situation. Bruno sat on his wife's still blood-stained bed and began his demonstration. He pointed to the left side of the bed and said Melissa was sitting there. Then he reached over, held the toy gun in a position as if storing the real weapon, and explained that he had accidentally pulled the trigger. But the experienced investigators quickly recognized contradictions in this recreation. The position Bruno indicated for Melissa didn't match the angle the bullet would have taken through his hand to hit her head. Furthermore, to create such a bullet trajectory, Bruno would have had to be pointing the gun in a completely different direction from what he described. This was the first sign that something wasn't right with this story. While Melissa was fighting for her life at the hospital, Bruno's behavior became increasingly suspicious to family members. Joanne, Melissa's sister, noticed that Bruno didn't spend as much time at his wife's bedside as other relatives. He would visit, stay for about an hour, then leave with excuses about needing rest or having work to do. For a man who had just lost his wife in a tragic accident, this attitude seemed unnatural. Even stranger, immediately after Melissa died, Bruno asked his daughters to help him clean up the house. He wanted them to remove all traces of blood, burn the mattress where their mother had been injured, donate Melissa's clothes, and even find a new home for Zeus, the beloved dog that Melissa cherished. To Chelsea and Sabrina, these requests seemed too hasty and disrespectful to their mother's memory. Chelsea and Sabrina's grandfather, a veteran police officer in Bucks County, expressed frustration with how local police handled the case. He told his granddaughters that if this incident had happened in his jurisdiction, Bruno would have been handcuffed and taken in for questioning from the very first night. The idea that a man could go home and sleep peacefully after his wife died under such circumstances was unacceptable. However, the Lackawanna County District Attorney's Office felt at the time that they didn't have enough evidence to charge Bruno with murder. Attorney Joe D'Andrea, whom Chelsea had suggested her father hire, later admitted that he didn't have to do much work to keep Bruno out of prison. Prosecutors had reviewed all available evidence and concluded they couldn't prove that Melissa's death was intentional murder. Melissa's death certificate listed the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head, but the manner of death was left pending. This meant authorities couldn't definitively determine whether it was an accident, suicide, or homicide. This uncertainty would haunt Melissa's family for years to come. No one in law enforcement told the family they had concluded it was an accident. Instead, the case remained in the files as an unsolved matter, waiting for new evidence that might emerge in the future. This decision would prove wise, though it would take nearly a decade to see why. During this time, Melissa's daughters and sister began having their own doubts about what really happened that night. They couldn't piece together all the fragments of Bruno's story, and the more they thought about it, the more they felt something wasn't right. But without concrete evidence, they could only live with these doubts and hope that someday the truth would be revealed. This incident left a deep scar in the Simpson community. For the neighbors, it was hard to believe that in a beautiful house in their peaceful neighborhood, such a tragedy could occur. They began questioning what they really knew about their neighbors' private lives and whether there were dark secrets hidden behind closed doors. The months following Melissa's death passed in painful silence for her family, but for Bruno, life seemed to continue with suspicious normalcy. Just a few months after his wife died, he began a romantic relationship with Tonya Wilczewski, a woman the entire family knew, as she was one of the people who had dined with Bruno and his wife on the night the tragedy occurred. Bruno's quick move into a new relationship caused waves of gossip in the local community. Many people felt uncomfortable with the speed at which he seemed to have moved past the grief of losing his wife. Tonya not only became Bruno's girlfriend, but also moved in to live with him in the same house where Melissa had died just months earlier. To neighbors who had witnessed the deep love between Bruno and Melissa over 25 years of marriage, this transition seemed too fast and disrespectful. While building his new life with Tonya, Bruno also took on the role of managing Melissa's estate. He convinced his two daughters to give up their rights to manage their mother's estate and appointed himself as the sole beneficiary. Chelsea and Sabrina, still grieving and shocked by their mother's loss, agreed to this request without thinking much about the consequences. They trusted their father would do right by the family. However, what the daughters didn't know at the time was that Bruno had begun a calculated plan to embezzle inheritance money that rightfully belonged to them. This estate included a substantial amount from a jackpot that Melissa's mother had won at a casino in Atlantic City in 2007. This money was worth $1.5 million, and part of it had been converted into an annuity for Melissa before she died. Throughout the years from 2013 to 2015, Bruno quietly diverted over $100,000 from this estate into his personal accounts. He did this cleverly, using his authority as estate administrator to hide these transactions from his daughter's attention. To Chelsea and Sabrina, they believed their father was managing the family finances responsibly and would share fairly when the time was right. But in 2015, Bruno accidentally revealed a detail that would completely change how Chelsea viewed her mother's death. In what seemed like a normal conversation, Bruno confided to his daughter that he had only meant to scare her mother. These words hit Chelsea like lightning from a clear sky. This was the first time her father had admitted that drawing the gun wasn't an accident, but an intentional act. This confession completely contradicted the story of a tragic accident that Bruno had told for the past 2 years. If he had only meant to scare Melissa, that meant he had deliberately drawn the gun and pointed it at his wife. This also meant that Melissa's death wasn't the result of an unfortunate accident, but the consequence of a threatening action that had gone too far. Chelsea felt like the world was spinning beneath her feet. She immediately contacted police to report what her father had said. However, at that time, this confession was considered circumstantial evidence and wasn't enough to reopen the investigation. Police noted the information but took no further action. Chelsea was forced to live with this painful knowledge for years, knowing that her mother's death might not have been an accident but unable to do anything to prove it. Meanwhile, life continued in Simpson. Melissa's case gradually became a faded memory in the community's mind, one of those unfortunate tragedies that people preferred to forget rather than remember. Bruno and Tonya lived what appeared to be a happy life, participating in social activities and maintaining the image of a normal couple in the community. But in 2020, something changed in Pennsylvania's justice system. The Criminal Investigative Assessment Unit, a department specialized in reviewing unsolved murder cases, was established to take advantage of advances in technology and investigative techniques to reopen old cases. 2 veteran investigators, Corporal Greg Allen and Corporal Dan Nylon, were tasked with reviewing dozens of cases that had been forgotten in the files. When Allen and Nylon began reviewing Melissa's case, one detail immediately caught their attention. In the initial 911 call, Bruno had given 3 different versions of what happened, all within the same phone call. First, he said they were arguing. Then he said he was playing with the gun. Finally, he said it was an accident. For experienced investigators, this inconsistency was a clear warning signal. The 2 investigators decided to review the video footage of Bruno's interrogation and recreation from 2013. When they carefully analyzed every detail, they discovered many other contradictions in his story. The position Bruno described for Melissa's seating didn't match the shooting angle necessary to create the recorded bullet trajectory. The way he held the toy gun and recreated the incident also couldn't explain how the bullet could pass cleanly through his hand and still have enough force to cause a fatal wound. But the most important discovery came when Nylon decided to dig deeper into evidence collected from the scene. He discovered that the Rocuba family's home security system had been collected in 2013, but no one had ever fully examined it. The The reason given at the time was that police didn't have the necessary technology to retrieve and analyze data from this system. However, by 2020, technology had advanced significantly. Nylon and Allen had access to modern equipment that could recover and enhance audio quality from surveillance video. When they were finally able to watch and listen to what had been recorded on the night of August 6, 2013, they discovered evidence that would completely change the nature of the case. The video not only captured the last images of Melissa alive, but also recorded audio of the violent argument between her and Bruno before the gunshot. At that time of year, their bedroom window was open, allowing the outdoor camera system to pick up sound from inside the house. The argument lasted nearly 30 minutes, with screaming, cursing, and the sound of objects being thrown and breaking. On the recording, they could hear Melissa's voice asking Bruno what was wrong with him, her screaming for him to get out of the room, and her insisting that she hadn't done anything wrong. This wasn't the sound of a couple peacefully preparing for bed, but the sound of a fierce and dangerous argument. And immediately after, they heard the single gunshot that ended the argument and took Melissa's life. This discovery completely debunked Bruno's story of a tragic accident. Clearly, there had been a serious conflict between the couple that night, and Melissa had died in the context of that conflict. For the first time in 7 years, investigators had concrete evidence that Bruno had lied about what really happened the night his wife died. With the shocking audio evidence in hand, Corporals Allen and Nylon knew they needed more than just a recording to build a solid case against Bruno. They needed experts to analyze every aspect of the evidence, from bullet angles to blood spatter patterns at the scene, to create a complete picture of what really happened that fateful night. Dr. Wayne Ross, a forensic expert with over 20 years of experience analyzing complex murder cases, was brought in to review all the physical evidence. After thoroughly studying crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and wound patterns, Dr. Ross reached conclusions that completely undermined Bruno's story of a tragic accident. According to Dr. Ross's analysis, to create the blood pattern and wound angle that had been documented, Bruno must have been in a position of dominance over Melissa when the gun fired. This meant he wasn't sitting beside his wife normally as he had described, but was standing or leaning over her in a threatening posture. Furthermore, the gun must have been held in a position pointing directly at Melissa's head, not being put away as Bruno had claimed. The blood spatter at the scene also told a different story from what Bruno had described. Blood droplets on the walls and ceiling indicated there had been a struggle or at least significant movement before the weapon was used. This wasn't the blood pattern of a static accident, but evidence of a dynamic conflict. Dr. Ross stated that all 7 different versions Bruno had given in various statements didn't match the scientific evidence. While forensic experts worked with the physical evidence, a team of audio specialists was tasked with analyzing and clarifying the recording from the security camera system. Using modern technology, they were able to separate different audio layers and highlight specific words spoken during the argument. The result was a clear recording that allowed investigators to hear every word spoken in Melissa's final minutes. On the enhanced recording, they could hear Melissa screaming, "Get out, I didn't do anything," in desperation. Her voice was full of fear and urgency, showing she felt seriously threatened. This wasn't the voice of a woman peacefully preparing for bed, but the voice of someone pleading for her life. Audio experts confirmed the recording quality was good enough to be used as evidence in court. With this new evidence, Allen and Nylon began building a comprehensive case against Bruno. They divided the evidence into 3 main categories: audio evidence disproving Bruno's statements, evidence of financial motive, and evidence of a history of domestic violence. The audio evidence from the surveillance video was the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. This was objective, indisputable evidence, showing that Bruno had lied about there being no argument that night. In fact, Melissa's own voice from beyond the grave had become the most important witness against the man who had taken her life. This was a rare situation in law where the victim could testify for her own case from beyond the grave. The financial motive also became clear when investigators dug into Bruno's estate management. They discovered he had embezzled over $100,000 from inheritance money that rightfully belonged to Melissa's daughters. The fact that Bruno had convinced his daughters to give up their estate management rights immediately after their mother died showed a suspicious level of premeditation. This suggested that Melissa's death might not have been an impulsive decision made in anger, but part of a larger plan. Evidence of a history of domestic violence was strengthened when investigators re-interviewed family members. Chelsea finally felt confident enough to tell what her mother had shared with her before she died. Melissa had told her daughter that Bruno had once drawn a gun to threaten her during an argument about their marriage. Sabrina also confirmed that she had moved out of her parents' house after witnessing domestic violence, where Bruno had grabbed Melissa's hair in anger. These revelations painted a picture of a man with a history of using threats and violence to control his wife. This also explained why Bruno seemed familiar with using a gun as a threatening tool. This wasn't the first time he had pointed a weapon at Melissa, just the time things had gone too far. When all the evidence was assembled, Lackawanna County District Attorney Mark Powell made the decision to officially reopen the investigation. He felt this might have been a case that should have been prosecuted back in 2013, and only the lack of technology to analyze audio evidence had allowed Bruno to escape justice for nearly a decade. Preparations for the arrest were carried out with extreme care. Allen and Nylon knew that Bruno owned a substantial weapons collection and might react unpredictably when he learned he was about to be arrested. They decided to make the arrest while Bruno was on his way to work, in a controllable environment and avoiding the risk of confrontation at his private residence. On the morning of June 3, 2022, 2 officers followed Bruno from his home to his workplace. As he drove on the familiar road he had traveled thousands of times over the past 9 years, he had no idea his life was about to change forever. An arrest warrant had been issued charging him with murder and theft related to embezzling Melissa's estate. The arrest went surprisingly smoothly. When police stopped Bruno's car and asked him to put his hands behind his back, he simply replied, "Okay," with a completely surprised expression. There was no resistance, no attempt to flee, just the silent acceptance of a man finally facing the consequences of his actions from nearly a decade earlier. When Bruno was led away in handcuffs, neighbors who had once believed he was the victim of a tragic accident now had to face the truth that they had been living next to a killer for 9 years. Trust in the community was shaken, and many people began questioning what they really knew about the private lives of those around them. For Chelsea and Sabrina, their father's arrest brought complex emotions. On one hand, they felt relieved that the truth about their mother's death was finally being revealed. On the other hand, they had to face the painful reality that the man they had once loved and trusted was the one who had taken away the most important woman in their lives. Their lives were once again turned upside down, but this time with hope that justice would finally be served. After Bruno's arrest, the real legal battle began. Defense attorney Joe DeAndrea, who had helped Bruno avoid charges nearly a decade earlier, was once again tasked with defending his client. But this time, he faced a completely different situation. The evidence the prosecution had wasn't vague speculation or minor contradictions in testimony, but solid evidence that could convince any jury. DeAndrea understood he was facing an enormous legal challenge. The recording from the home security system was a powerful legal weapon that would be very difficult to counter. How could he explain to a jury why his client had lied about there being no argument that night? How could he justify Bruno hiding the truth for nearly a decade if it really was just a tragic accident? The only strategy DeAndrea could think of was to focus on the wound to Bruno's hand. He argued that who would shoot themselves through their own hand to kill someone else? This wound, he contended, proved that Bruno was also a victim of a tragic accident, not a deliberate perpetrator. However, even as he made this argument, DeAndrea knew it had major holes that the prosecution could exploit. But DeAndrea's biggest concern wasn't about the logic of the case, but about the emotions it would generate in the courtroom. He knew that when the jury heard the recording of Melissa's final minutes, when they heard her screaming in fear and desperation, they would find it difficult to maintain the objectivity needed to consider evidence fairly. The voice of a woman pleading for her life would echo in the courtroom and in each jury member's mind long after the trial ended. Furthermore, D'Andrea worried about the risk of his client being convicted of first-degree murder, which would mean life in prison without the possibility of parole. At Bruno's current age, such a sentence would essentially be a slow death sentence. Considering this risk, D'Andrea began exploring the possibility of plea negotiations with prosecutors. From the prosecution side, Mark Powell and his team felt confident about the strength of the case they had built. They had undeniable audio evidence, 7 contradictory versions from Bruno's statements, clear financial motive, and evidence of a history of domestic violence. This was the kind of case prosecutors dream of, a case with solid evidence and a clear story that a jury could understand and relate to. However, Powell also understood that taking a case to trial always carried risks. Juries could be unpredictable, and even with the strongest evidence, there was still a possibility that a jury member might have reasonable doubt about Bruno's guilt. Powell decided he was willing to consider a plea agreement if it ensured that Bruno would serve significant prison time. After months of negotiations in May 2024, both sides reached an agreement. Bruno would plead guilty to third-degree murder, and the theft charge would be dropped. Third-degree murder acknowledged that Bruno didn't intend to kill Melissa beforehand, but his actions were so seriously reckless that they led to her death. This meant Bruno admitted that having a gun, drinking alcohol, and engaging in a heated argument had created a dangerous situation that he could and should have avoided. On January 8, 2025, nearly 12 years after Melissa's death, the final sentencing hearing took place. This was the day Melissa's family had waited for over a decade, the day they could finally look directly into the eyes of the man who had taken their loved one and tell him their true feelings. Joanne, Melissa's sister, was allowed to read her victim impact statement before the court. She looked directly into Bruno's eyes, forcing him to face someone whose face nearly mirrored the woman whose life he had taken. She told him that throughout this entire process, he had never shown an ounce of remorse. She reminded him that he had killed his daughter's mother, and although he had tried to erase Melissa's existence, he could never erase the good memories of her. Joe White, Melissa's father, also had the opportunity to express his pain. He said Bruno had taken away his firstborn child, and he didn't know if he would ever get over this grief. For a man who had once considered Bruno like his own son, this betrayal was even more painful than losing his daughter. When it was Bruno's turn to speak, he finally admitted that he loved Melissa and didn't expect forgiveness from the family. He said he couldn't forgive himself for what had happened. This was the first and only apology Bruno had offered in 11 years. But for many present in the courtroom, it came too late and seemed insincere. Judge Mary Walsh Dempsey sentenced Bruno to 12 to 40 years in prison. With time already served, Bruno could be considered for parole starting in 2035, when he would be 70 years old. For a man his age, even the earliest possibility of parole meant he would spend most or all of his remaining years behind bars. But for Melissa's daughters, this sentence brought very complex emotions. Chelsea said she had gotten justice for her mother, but now she had also lost her father. Her son had lost his grandfather, and this pained her because she knew he was the person she had to protect from all this hurt. Sabrina felt her father didn't deserve to get out of prison, but she also admitted she still loved and missed him. Joanne pledged that she would be present at every future parole hearing for Bruno to oppose his release. For her, 12 years wasn't enough to compensate for her sister's life and all the suffering the family had endured. But this family's tragedy wasn't over. Just weeks after the documentary interview in March 2025, Chelsea faced another loss. Greg, her 13-year-old son, died in an all-terrain vehicle accident. The child who had lost his grandmother when young, then lost his grandfather to prison, now also left this world, leaving Chelsea alone to face indescribable pain. For Chelsea, it felt like this shouldn't be her family's story. This was the kind of tragedy people read about in books or watch on TV, not something that happens in their real lives. But that's exactly what had happened, and they had to find a way to live with this reality. Despite everything, the family continued to honor Melissa's memory. Chelsea hung pictures of her mother throughout her home and told her daughter about the wonderful grandmother she never got to meet. She wanted to ensure that Melissa would be remembered as a loving mother and devoted grandmother, not just as the victim of a horrific crime. The story of Melissa Rocuba leaves profound lessons about life, justice, and human nature that we all need to remember. First, about the power of technology in seeking truth. This case proved that evidence can sleep for years until technology develops enough to awaken it. The recording from the home security system became an incorruptible witness, reminding us that in the digital age, truth can be preserved in ways we never imagined. Second, about the importance of never giving up the search for justice. Investigators Allen and Nylon proved that no case is too old to be revisited. Their persistence and professionalism brought justice to Melissa after nearly a decade of waiting. Third, about the hidden dangers of domestic violence. The Rocuba family was once considered a model of happiness in their community. This reminds us that perfect appearances can hide dark secrets, and we need to be more sensitive to warning signs. Finally, about the power of family in seeking truth. Despite facing the complexity of emotions, loving their father while seeking justice for their mother, Melissa's daughters never gave up. They proved that true love sometimes requires painful but right decisions. Melissa Rocuba may be gone, but her voice from beyond the grave has become a powerful reminder. Truth will never die, and justice, however late, is still justice.